And lastly, just make sure you are on speaker view. That way you will see Sophie and Kate full screen. So now I'd like to introduce Kate, who'll be taking things from here. Kate Eltham is a Brisbane writer and arts manager and chair of Love Oz YA, a national organisation promoting Australian youth literature. Over to you, Kate.
Well, good evening, everybody. I also wanted to let you know that I happen to be Zooming in this evening from Quandamooka country in Queensland, which is the lands of the Ngugi, Gunpul and Nunukul people. And I want to recognise their custodianship of this beautiful land that I am sitting on and pay my respects to their elders and ancestors, and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you happen to be zooming into the discussion to you from today, and to welcome and acknowledge any First Nations people who are present with us tonight and attending with us right now. I am so delighted to be here tonight to host this discussion with the delightful Sophie Green. My only regret about tonight's event is that it couldn't be in person because like so many other friends across the world right now, we have been separated for quite some time and haven't managed to share space for a little while. So I'm taking the time to revel in this lovely digital connection for this evening. So I want to first introduce you to Sophie as an author. If you've come across her wonderful books before, you will know her as the author of such wonderful titles as the Inaugural Meeting of the Fairvale Ladies Book Club, which was a top 10 book top 10 best-selling book in Australia, and also the Shelly Bay Ladies Swimming Circle, also a bestseller in Australia. And we are here tonight to talk about her wonderful new book, which I'm going to hold up here so you can see it, Thursdays at Orange Blossom House. So welcome, Sophie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Kate. And I'm on the lands of the Barrogal people in the Eora Nation, lower North Shore of Sydney, and I pay my respects to their elders and ancestors. And I just want to say before we start that, and I said this to Yana beforehand, but Kate is a Queensland treasure, and she has done so much for writing in Queensland, for the arts in Queensland. She's an incredibly inspirational, wonderful human being. So I'm so lucky to have her with me tonight.
You.
Very first and only.
About you this evening.
I'm much happier talking about you, but whatever. Yes.
Thank you. And I also wanted to welcome all of you for joining us tonight. I know that it's sort of like the dinner rush hour, especially if you've got young Jarjams at home. So thank you for joining us. And particularly, I just wanted to say for any of you who happen to be in a place of lockdown or harsh restrictions right now, to say thank you for joining us. We are with you tonight and we see you, and you have our gratitude and our empathy as well. There's some very hard yards being done by many people in our community right now. And actually, Sophie, you're in Sydney, which means you've been in lockdown for quite some time. So my first question really is, how are you? How are you as an author trying to write books and work and make it through this pandemic? How are you going?
I'm going well. Thank you for asking. I actually wrote Orange Blossom House in lockdown last year. So maybe it's appropriate, I don't know. I decided that my policy for this lockdown, because I've been home since second last week of June, and I read years ago about a study that was done by two researchers where they catalogued all the combinations of facial expressions, and they discovered at the time they were cataloguing the sad, angry expressions that they actually became depressed. And that's when they started to realise that the facial expressions work from the outside in as well as the inside out. So these days I'm starting every day with a fake smile, because the fake smile will work from the outside in on the days when it's not quite there naturally. And I'm passing on that tip to other people because it does actually work. It's a bit like laughing yoga, if people have seen that. So, but look, we have to do it. We understand that this is necessary. It's disappointing that some people are breaching restrictions, but most of us are committed to seeing this through, and we just have to keep our heads down, and it will be over one day.
And I'm kind of curious about how you've been managing your creative practice during this time, because obviously, this is, a period where you're working as well. You've got a lot of time on the screen, and then you've got to try and also front back up to the keyboard again for writing with that kind of oppressive background of being in lockdown as well, has it affected the way that you write books?
It has. Well, last year, because I didn't start writing Orange Blossom House until after lockdown, national lockdown had begun. And up until that point, I'd written on either end of my workday on public transport. So I had 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the afternoon, and then I'd do some on the weekends, and that was my routine. And then once we were not traveling to the office anymore, I had to come up with something different. So I decided that I would write at night, because I'm actually quite awake at night. So like 9, 10 o'clock at night, I'll just do an hour, and I could work up a good head of steam doing that. So I thought, okay, well, that's all right. And then, so I have already written next year's book and delivered it. And so I wrote it that way, even though we were, until recently, going in and out of work and I was back on public transport, I still thought, no, I'll keep that routine. So I think if I tried to hold fast to the habits I had, that would have been really difficult. And it was easier just to let them go and see what came through. And that turned out being a habit I prefer.
I think that's kind of a perfect segue into discussing this book that we're all gathering to talk about tonight, Thursdays at Orange Blossom House, because to me there is so much in this book that really resonates with our current situation. But first, I was wondering if perhaps you could just give us all a little précis of the novel.
Sure. So it's set in Cairns in 1993, and that's actually the year I started practicing yoga. That was a key reason for choosing that year, because I had my memories of what it was like to be a beginner at that time and what yoga in Australia was like at that time. And so there are 3 main characters. The first is Grace Maud, who's in her 70s. There's Patricia, she's a former cane farmer who's now living in town away from her son, who's running the property with his wife. And there's Patricia, who's a teacher in her 40s, who's moved back to Cairns to look after her aging parents because her brothers and sister aren't able to. And then Dorothy, who's in her 30s, who runs a cafe with her husband. And she's been trying to get pregnant for a while, and she's had miscarriage after miscarriage and is feeling quite desolate. And so the 3 of them feel disconnected from themselves and their bodies. And as someone who's been teaching yoga in particular for almost 20 years, bodies are of interest to me. They were an interest that I explored in Shelly Bay as well. So they find themselves in a yoga class taught by a French woman called Sandrine. Sandrine is the only character who's actually remotely like me in any of the books I've written. And that's only because when I had to come up with something a yoga teacher would say in class, I naturally drew on things that I would say. She's not like me personality-wise or life-wise, but just, oh, well, I've got to plagiarize from myself.
I think, I mean, to me, the biggest theme running through this book is that idea of embodiment, right? It's that connection between our bodies and our thoughts and our feelings. And really all of the women in the novel start the book from a place of disconnection. And there was a line that you had, I think in fact, all of the things that I underlined in pencil as I was reading through were little quotes from Sandrine, the yoga teacher from her class, which now has me wondering if these are things that you've also said. But one of them, she says, is the body keeps our secrets.
Yeah.
The body keeps our secrets for us, and sometimes yoga brings them out.
For sure. Yes, that is something I've said in class, and it's something I've seen, it's something I've experienced in my practice, and it's part of the reason why when I teach, I'm really mindful of the responsibility I have, because people aren't coming to class usually just to have an exercise routine. They're coming to experience something, and then sometimes they're not sure what it is they want to experience. They just know they're there, usually for transformation. And but I think that writing fiction is an extension of that. I came to realize pretty much through writing the novel that essentially for me, writing fiction is an extension of teaching yoga rather than the other way around, or that they're companionate in some way. And I think that's just because yoga has been in my life for so long that I don't actually know what life is without it. And as my teacher would say, you don't want to do yoga, you want to be yoga.
But it's interesting, like, for, having been in and out of lockdowns and feeling like, I honestly feel like so much of my existence just is digital these days. It was so refreshing. It was almost emotional at different points of reading this book to be reminded of how important it is to locate yourself within your body and to sort of make that connection between what's happening in your body and perhaps what that is pointing to in what might be going on in your head or in your feelings as well. And I think there's a couple of beautiful places that you explore that in the book as well.
Thank you. Yeah, the body and the mind are the same thing. And I think we tend to think creativity comes from the brain. Creativity comes from the mind, which is in the body. So the way to access creativity is through the body, rather than trying to push it out of the cerebrum, essentially, or push it out of your ego or some other part of you. And I think, yeah, the body will always tell us the story of what's going on. We've all had physical reactions to people we meet, whether that's good or bad, and we try to rationalize them away, particularly if it's a bad reaction. We think, oh, I should like this person for whatever reason. We're often rationalizing away something that our body intrinsically knows. I've studied a little bit of energy medicine from other systems, and there are certainly some systems that believe that the body is aware of what's going on months before the conscious mind knows. And I've had that experience myself, where something's happened and I think, what is going on here? And then the answer will turn up months later. I don't want to go into specifics, but it's usually pretty dramatic in that situation. But there are things we in our so-called Western, so-called rationalized minds we've caused ourselves to become divorced from that knowledge that actually has existed in some systems for a very long time. And we think we're very clever and that everything's happening below our chins. And this is, I like to call, often when I'm teaching, I'll call the region between the navel and the top of the thighs the dark continent, because everyone claims they have no idea what's going on down there. They've never visited there. They don't have a visa. They can't get there. And every time I say it in class, someone snorts knowingly or laughs. So I think, yeah, you're all aware that you look at that part of your body with your back pain and your hip joints and your digestive problems, and you think it belongs to someone else. It does not. It's part of the landscape of your life. It's the body you're carrying around. And if nothing else, I hope that maybe reading the novel or doing some other embodied activities helps people to really connect with their body and realize it is the same thing as their mind, and it's a beautiful creation. It's the world's greatest self-correcting mechanism, the human body.
Well, you certainly had me doing stretches and breathing exercises at different points. But I also thought what was interesting about the way that you set up the interactions between the yoga teacher, Sandrine, and the main characters was how frequently Sandrine was able to pinpoint and observe what was going on before the characters were able to come to that awareness themselves. And sometimes she would point it out, and sometimes through your telling of the story, the reader could see what was happening as well. And I wondered if you as a yoga teacher have that experience, that you can see your students experiencing a block perhaps, or a weight, or some sort of barrier that is between them and a solution or a way forward through the way that they're undertaking their yoga practice.
Yes, and I based it on my own experience teaching, and it is because the body keeps the score and tells the stories, essentially. And particularly if it's people I've seen regularly over time, I'll always put students into downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana, very early on in a practice, and that's so I can actually see what's going on. Because if they're people I know have come regularly, I can see straight away if something's changed since the last class, just from that one posture. And sometimes I will go and say various things, or I'll just prod a little spot. I think Sandrine does a bit of prodding as well, and just say, what is that? What's happened since the last time? I'm not necessarily aware of what I'm carrying around either. It would take someone outside of me to tell me that, which is why it is so valuable to go to a class if and when you can. But yeah, it's fascinating. And the language, in English, we don't really have those words anymore. The French talk about having spleen, and they have some other words related to the body for emotions. We talk about people being a pain in the neck. And I think legitimately that comes from the fact that if someone's bothering you and you're worrying about them, you will crick your head in one direction or the other. Right for masculine, left for feminine, and then that'll become a pain in the neck. And because you're thinking about them. And that's, I could go more and more into energy theory of the body and to explain that. But we used to have that language around the body and emotion and experiences, and we've lost it, in English at least.
And of course, really the other central pillar of this novel is, unsurprisingly for a Sophie Green novel, is the female relationships at the heart of it. And I really think this novel really turns on the bonds that are developed between women of different generations. And I wanted to offer you my gratitude for that, because I really feel it needs to be said that women's lives are important and worth exploring in fiction, and that doesn't necessarily have to be done via the vehicle of the way that woman is in service to a plot or to another character or to a romance or something like that. And that I just kind of reveled in that reading this book. I was just like, oh, it's like going to coffee with your friends and having a good old yarn about what's going on in your life. I thought it sort of felt like all of the things that the women were experiencing were things that I had either a personal experience of or had close female friendships or relationships who had been through that as well. And it was such a balm, I think, for me to be able to kind of spend time with the characters in that way.
Well, thank you for saying that, and I'm glad that came across, because that's what I hoped would come through. I think I realised I've been lucky to have been able to observe my mother at work over the years from childhood, because she had such an age range of friends, and also geographically spread. Sybil and Rita in Fairvale are based on my mother and my godmother, who nursed together in Sydney, and then my godmother went back to the property in the Riverina, and they've never lived in the same place since, but they're on the phone to each other every second day, basically. And I watched my mother maintain those friendships, but also have close connections with women who are quite a bit older than her and sometimes younger than her. And I have those sorts of friendships now. And they're friendships that can outlast marriages, that you can make a friend in your 20s and you'll be friends past the age your parents have died. Sometimes tragically they can outlast your relationship with a child, depending on what happens. And we can make those friendships at any age if we're open to them, if we haven't closed our minds to what someone else might be like in our lives, or what they might be like as an individual. I have such a close friend who I only met in the past few years, and we were playing tennis in a group tennis class. And until the 5 kilometre rule came into Sydney this week, we played every Sunday morning at 6 a.m. And our friendship was forged I like to say, in the crucible of whacking balls at each other with as much force as we can muster, because we are not interested in playing with each other against other people. We're only interested in playing against each other. And we're incredibly close friends, because I think we found out who the other was in that environment, and we stuck with it. We kept showing up through the wind and the cold and winter and heat of summer, and changing schedules and life things and all that stuff going on, and we're still there. And so that actually heavily influenced Shelly Bay. I've got to say, that particular friendship and meeting her that way, because it often is through those common activities that you can meet new people, because you're all attracted to that one activity for whatever reason. Yoga classes are full of different bodies and different ages and different backgrounds and all sorts of things, and I'm always fascinated by the array of people I've met through classes.
I wanted to talk about the women of this book, some of the characters, and Grace Maud, who's hands down my favourite character throughout the book.
She's an old boss.
I mean, she's just unapologetically herself in every single interaction. And, she's a woman in her 70s, but she is really, I think, struggling with a sense of what is her place in the world, that feeling of being usurped, having a very clear purpose throughout her life and a clear understanding about what she was there to do. She was there to run the family farm. She had inherited this legacy from her family, had built it up, had worked that land, and had invited her son into that practice. And, sort of at the beginning of the book, she is kind of now living in town on her own. You know, she's still a co-owner, it's her name on the deed of the farm. It's her business, but really it's not, you know, it's her son's business. And it's that struggle of who am I now and where do I fit into this picture that I thought was so interesting. And I have reflected on that a little bit since my own mother retired. She was a teacher and a primary school principal for 50 years. And, you know, watching that interesting transition from having an incredibly busy, high performing, high skill, high knowledge base work practice to sort of stopping that, and then sort of, I guess, casting around a little while to sort of find where she felt effective in the world and where she felt like that expertise and knowledge and skill was still recognized. And I wondered if you if those sorts of sort of, I guess, ideas around women's usefulness in the world were some of the things that you were thinking about with Grace Maud.
I think, well, there are a couple of things that I was thinking about with her. One of them was succession planning, actually, which is often an issue for rural families, and how they manage. In Grace Maud's case, she only has one heir, but sometimes there are more, and you have to think about how you divvy up the property, who's prepared to work on the property, all those sorts of things. I think with her and her sense of usefulness, it was not necessarily about women and usefulness. It was actually people over a certain age. My father should have retired from his job, which is running a business, a long time ago, and let my brother, who's working with him, have a go at it. He doesn't want to. I mean, COVID stopped him because he can't go in, but it was actually more influenced, I think, by watching him and his sense of who he was, what that work gives him about his sense of self. But I also do know someone, a woman who's worked a family property for years, and in her case, it was what happens when you're not on the tractor at 2 a.m. every morning, you know, during harvest or whatever, or when you're sowing, and if you're not rocketing out to get the lambs when they're born, and that's a 7-day-a-week job, and there is no set time frame, and then suddenly it's over. And physically, what do you do with yourself when you're so used to working yourself hard and feeling like your body is an attachment to that land, and vice versa? So all of that was in my brain when it came to Grace Maud.
And I think it's also interesting that Grace Maud kind of struggles with, not being physically involved in running the farm any longer, but feeling quite disconnected when her son makes really significant decisions about the future of the business, seemingly without her. And so it's also that kind of feeling of, I guess, having a view about the way things should be done and needing to kind of come to a place of understanding and compromise, I guess. And that's very hard to do when it's your own family that you have to make that arrangement with.
I think often it's the hardest. I mean, it's often why people talk about struggling to tell the people closest to them how terrible they're feeling about something, how depressed they are, how miserable they are. It feels like they should be the logical people you tell. But the stakes in those relationships are so high that I think we often feel like just one thing could tip it one way or the other, and you don't necessarily know what that thing will be, so don't take the risk. And in Grace Maud's case, it's she does feel like she's been excluded because she has been. But her son, for his part, and we only have her point of view, we don't get to know what Tom, her son, is really thinking. And it's that, he would be thinking that he's trying to do the best for his family. Like he's trying to forge ahead. He's trying to make change, keep with the trends, all those things that he may not have explained to anyone, but are in his brain. And ultimately, she has to decide whether she thinks what he's doing is from the good of his heart or not. And he's her son, so that's something that it's a decision she needs to base on her long knowledge of him.
And I think of herself too, like it's that coming to an understanding about what actually is underneath those feelings of resistance to the ideas that he's coming to her with as well. And it's actually the relationship she builds up with the other women that helps her to be a little bit more mindful and aware of that, I think, as well. Just picking up on what you were saying about not wanting to sort of say too much to the ones who are closest to you about how you're really feeling and how miserable you are. That kind of brings me a little bit to Dorothy in the novel. So Dorothy's in her 30s. She's running a cafe with her husband. She is struggling with her fertility journey, and and for me, one of the interesting things about her storyline is that as she explores new possible pathways and treatments around her fertility, because as I said, in the early to mid 90s, I was, just reminded how new and innovative and rare it was for particularly rural women to undertake the journey of IVF as well. So that was quite fascinating. But one of the things that struck me about Dorothy is that throughout the book, she is so desperate not to be a burden when it comes to her feelings, and just allowing her pain and her sort of state of being to stand on its own and to be expressed, as though that is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And there's a couple of passages in the book where I was really kind of struck by, yes, this is a female thing. I don't think it's inherently female thing, but I think there are these pressures that women tend to inherit about, putting others first and not necessarily expressing when we have needs emotionally, and, allowing them to be expressed and dealt with and accepted by those around us. I was just really struck by that, and all of the ways in which we assume sort of caring relationships in our lives, and that they are prioritized ahead of our own.
Yeah, well, absolutely, it was influenced by the fact that little girls are socialized to think about everyone else and their feelings, and it's very convenient for everyone else when we do that, when we grow up to become women who will put everyone else first, because then they can rely on us to do all sorts of things. I think it's almost a revolutionary act as an adult woman to stop and say, no, actually, I'm going to put myself first. And I think partly that feeds into the self-care movement, and perhaps has actually been prompted by yoga practice over the past few years with that. And that's somewhat morphed into a self-care thing. I'm not sure.
Industry.
But I'm going to blame Gwyneth Paltrow. But yeah, that's definitely, I think also with Dorothy, because she has a sister who has a disability, that sister is a burden to her, and she can't ever say it, primarily because she loves her, and she doesn't want to believe that she's a burden, but she was charged with the responsibility of caring for this child while her parents worked. And we can see that her parents had to work because they had 2 children to support, and they were in a new country. But Dorothy, as a child, can't consider that, because all she knows is what she has in front of her, the siblings she has to look after, the time she didn't have for herself, all the anger that she might have about that's never been expressed, and that is stuck in her body somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to come out.
And it's interesting because Dorothy is one of the last, really, I think, for those things to come out through her yoga practice. Like there's quite interesting, quite early transformations that have happened for Patricia, the other main character, and for Grace Maud. But again and again, Sandrine in their class, it sort of says, this is stuck. There's something there. There's a barrier there that you're not able to express yet. And it takes quite some time for Dorothy to be able to find that language, to be able to do that. And I think too, what was there are sort of points of the book where she is in a new situation and is able to really, I think, find courage is not the word I'm looking for, but it's really the self-respect, let's say that, to be able to say, these are my needs. And this is what I'm going to need to put in place to make sure they're met. And I was just cheering at that point. I was just like, yes, I'm so happy for you, Dorothy, and for everybody else who's reading this right now.
Yeah, because as I said, it's a almost revolutionary act, and for her, well, look, for a lot of people who hold on to that kind of pain and anger, and I think in the case of women's bodies, it's often anger, because that's not socially acceptable to express in any circumstance, and even when you're a little girl, it's not that acceptable to express. So a lot of people will hang on to it because it's safe, it's what they know, and they're not sure what's on the other side of it. And it is so terrifying to let it go. Like their life will almost undoubtedly improve if they do, but they don't know what that feels like. And so I've seen it so often, and I talk in the book about, and I've put in the book about Dorothy's armor, because you can see it in some people. They will walk in the world with armor. They've got their shoulders hunched forward, like they're protecting that heart. Things have calcified through the backs of their bodies. It's rigid, and it takes a lot to not necessarily pierce the armor, but dismantle it, which is what's required in order for them to really move freely in the world, both physically, emotionally, and energetically. And yeah, so she was just the result of me seeing over and over again people who would rather hang on to all of that sediment, and not just sediment, but baked in rock, I think, and leave it there. And often for the rest of their lives. And it's at a certain point, if you're a teacher, you have to let that go. You can't, it's not our job to tell people what they have to do, or need to do, or should do, whatever. They have to come to it themselves. And if they don't, they don't. And that's their story. But
I think that's an interesting contrast with the final main character, Patricia, because so Patricia, she's a woman in her late 40s. She's a school teacher. But really the most significant sort of thing that shapes her life is the caring role that she plays for her elderly parents, particularly whom she lives with, particularly her mother, who is in the early stages of dementia. And there's a lot of scenes with Patricia around the relationships with her siblings as well, and the sort of roles that become, I guess, unofficially allocated to different, offspring in a family, because of life circumstances. Somebody might have moved away and they're not really in a position to be present and do that caring role, or others might be, there's obviously a lot of gender stereotypes that can potentially come into play there as well. But I just thought it was interesting with Patricia that she thinks really, really hard about her circumstances and what is limiting her. And to a certain extent, she's making quite conscious choices, actually, in accepting those limitations because of her love for her family, and wanting to make sure that she's putting that love first, even though it obviously has a quite detrimental effect in her achieving some of her other goals that she has as well.
Yeah, I think the line I gave her, and that's when I got her as a character, was when she said, she admits to herself that caring for her parents is not what she wants to do, but it's what she's prepared to do. And I think those acts, we think about acts of love as grand gestures, but really they are the small everyday gestures that add up to tending to someone who, in Patricia's case, is not someone who actually loves her back. She's not sure that her mother loves her. Her mother has never demonstrated much love towards her, but Patricia loves her parents, and she feels it as her duty, and that's okay. Like if a duty is something that you're prepared to take on because you want to express your love that way, and she does, then it's not a burden, I guess, is the difference between it. It can be burdensome, but it's not entirely a burden.
Yeah.
And I think it's also with her, I wanted to express that idea, well, maybe with all of them, that, as I said, love is often thought of as grand gestures, and so is courage. But there are so many people whose lives, it's a small act of courage. Getting out of bed in the morning is an act of courage. Tending to the parent who you think may hate you, never loved you, is an act of courage. Showing up to work when all of this is going on in your life so you can be present for the students that you have to teach is an act of courage. And I think if we actually gave that to ourselves more often and thought, you know what, I actually have been quite courageous today. I really didn't want to do this. I felt terrible, but I managed to put one foot in front of the other. I got out of bed, and maybe particularly this pandemic time, it's useful. But it's just reframing how we live our daily lives and realizing we don't need to save the world or do these huge things in order to be courageous, and that courage can gain its own momentum. Actually, I think if you and that's something I learned definitely on the mat was having to. My teacher, she'll often say, going into a standing balance, she'll say, "Have courage," and it's that small thing of thinking, Yeah, because I might fall over. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe my balance is not what it was the last time I did this posture. I might fall on my head. So I need to feel courageous to do it. And the idea that that is courage, because there's an unknown beyond me stepping up onto one foot with my head down and the other leg up. Maybe I will fall over, look stupid, or feel stupid just because I'm home alone practicing. And so I think all the things I've done over the years where I've had to go into that valley of pain, and it often is physical pain, which I write about as well, and not knowing what's there, having the courage to do it, it's always been transformative in a good way. That doesn't mean that I always embrace it and feel courageous every time I come up against the valley of pain, but I'll go there because it will be at the very least interesting. And so I think that there have been times in my life, as you know, 10 years ago, I almost died. I had to be extremely courageous going into emergency in Royal North Shore Hospital, and there was no guarantee I was going to make it out alive. And that required me to draw on every single bit of training I had ever done on the mat, not breathwork necessarily, but all the beliefs, all the practice, everything that was synthesized in that moment so that I could be present right then and give myself the best chance I could of coming out of that experience alive. Obviously it worked, mainly due to the doctors and nurses who were working there, but we never know when we're going to need that. And I think that's why, for me, that practice has always been so valuable, and I've had to call on it again to be courageous in moments when I wasn't prepared for courage to be required. I didn't know it was coming, but we never do.
I think for Patricia too, though, in addition to that, that choice that she's making, so she's choosing that act of service really towards her parents. For me, the true transformation for her is in also learning to accept acts of service. So, you know, she has a significant person in her life who is showing up again and again and again, who is trying to demonstrate that to them she is valued, she is beautiful, she is desirable, she is you know, a whole person that they really do you know, that they really value. And she takes a long time to be able to accept that gift, you know, that offering.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I thought that was a really interesting kind of dynamic that plays out there, because it wasn't so much, I felt that you weren't creating a character that is that has low self-esteem or anything like that, but just really unable to accept that this is a perfectly valid, you know, this is a perfectly valid offering, and then it's perfectly valid to accept it.
Yeah, because I think she's thought herself into the role she has to play, and the role she chose for herself at this point in her life was to be the dutiful daughter, and she'd actually cut out any potential for anything else. I mean, she does open herself up to friendships, but in terms of big changes in her life, she's made her commitment, and she's not unhappy about it. It's her karma yoga, and she doesn't know how long it will last, and that was okay. So I think she's quite rigid mentally, and that's expressed through her rigid hips as well. I think at one point I have Sandrine saying, "Free your hips and the mind will follow," and that can be true. So I think with her, it's actually her letting go of fixed ideas, the same way she's had to let go of fixtures inside her own joints, and that's when she realizes that maybe the world's a bit brighter, or a bit wider, or a bit breezier than she thought before.
You said at the beginning that you chose the mid-90s as the time setting for the book because that was when you started practicing yoga. Why did you choose the far North Queensland location setting?
Well, actually, that was the publisher's suggestion. I was fixated on my beloved Sunshine Coast because I've spent so much time there, and I thought, oh, I get to go and research if I do that. As it turned out, I couldn't go anywhere near Queensland for most of last year. But the publisher suggested far North Queensland, and I had been there several times and loved it. I had thought about it and dismissed it because Fairvale is set in the Northern Territory, and I thought I couldn't do another top end kind of story, but they were very keen. And I thought, well, I am very happy to spend my time in lockdown daydreaming about that extraordinary part of your state. that I can't get to and still can't get to.
Well, we would love to see you up this way when it's possible.
I think that there are a whole lot of Sydney-siders who just daydream about Queensland. It's like a quiet little thing we don't talk to each other about, but we all know we're doing it.
Well, I think it turns out to be a gift. I think there's plenty of us in Southeast Queensland that would dream about a sojourn in far North Queensland as well. I mean, there's a point at which the characters have a little side trip to Port Douglas, and Port Douglas has a very special place in my heart because I spent my honeymoon there. But it is that kind of feeling where things kind of slow down. I feel like it's a place where time doesn't, run at the same pace that it does when I'm, in Brisbane. And that gelled very well with the mid-90s kind of setting of the book as well. It just didn't feel, because we live in this such digitally saturated existence where I feel like our brains are just completely crammed with information 24/7. It was honestly so soothing to spend time in this place and time and just sort of think, oh, that's right. I remember that life was a little bit less technologically kind of,
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the first time I ever went to Port Douglas was 1991. So that did also have a slight influence on the setting, because I thought, because I'm writing about the not so distant past, but still having that slightly nostalgic sheen on it means I'm working from memory and describing light and how it felt from the point of memory, which I think works better for that kind of storytelling than trying to describe something as it is right now, like going there now and then describing what I'm seeing. So it just gives it that maybe softer edge.
And I felt like we couldn't finish up, or at least before we head to questions, without asking, maybe not a teaser, but could you give us a little bit of something about what you're working on for your next book?
The next one, so as you know, I write about country music as a hobby, and I have done for 10 years, and Australian country music.
Please tell me this is going to be the country music novel.
It's not going to be about country music, because I think I know far too much about Australian country music, but it is about music in it. It is actually set near Tamworth, but it's a fictional town, because I also thought I wanted to set it in that Liverpool Plains, Kamilaroi area, and because I love it. Every time I go to the festival and I enter that part of Australia, my heart lifts, I smile, and it's just this beautiful, stunning, wide countryside with these amazing skies at night. And so I thought, okay, well, let's do that. So it's set in a town, and there are 5 characters. So Orange Blossom has 3, Shelly Bay has 4 main characters, Fairvale had 5. And so it was going to be 4, but there was one character who just completely barged her way into having a point of view, and she definitely belongs there. She's kind of taken over the whole thing. But so yeah, she's an opera singer. That's probably why she's taken over. She's used to being a diva.
Well, I am sort of hanging out for the Sophie Green optioned sort of novel that becomes the Australian Nashville TV show. So please do.
Well, thank you. I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, we would love to see the country music one.
I don't think any of my books are suitable for adaptation, but thank you for thinking so.
I think we're around about the time for questions. Is that right, Yana?
Yeah, for sure. We've got a few coming in. We will start off with Sarah's question. And Sophie, she's asking about how much research you had to do, and particularly as we were chatting before the event, that it's set in the 90s, and ensuring the accuracy of the 90s in terms of technology and names and stuff like that. So how much research went into Orange Blossom?
Well, I was alive in the 90s, so and did start practicing yoga then, so I was an adult. So I did rely on memory again for the point of view that I wanted to have that slightly nostalgic sheen. So I don't like things to be too intricately detailed. Having said that, I do a lot of research online, not on Wikipedia. I go to various film sound archive places and ARIA charts and things like that. And then for landscape, I look at photos. So I don't tend to read about the area. I'll do some, and if I could have made it to far North Queensland last year, I absolutely would have. Because I wanted to go, but also because I was setting the book there. There was a 2-week window in July. By the time I thought about booking flights, the border had closed again. And then when it reopened in December for a brief glimmer, it was too late essentially to go. So in terms of the book, so I do as much research as I can, but I'm also not a big fan of putting a ton of detail in, just because I know as a reader, I like it when I'm starting to form my own picture in my mind of things. And if the author then jumps in with a lot of detail, most of my characters aren't heavily described in terms of how they look. And it's for that reason that I'll often, as soon as a character starts talking in a book I'm reading, I have an idea of them. And if then, 20 pages in, the author says, oh, and they look like this, I think, no, that's not who that person is in my mind. So I'll usually just give brief detail, and same with buildings and things like that, because I think that encourages our imagination as readers.
And then off the back of that, I was wondering, how do you think yoga as a practice has changed since you started practicing in the mid-90s to today?
Oh, hugely, monumentally. So when I started practicing, it was in a church hall, and the church halls were the next step up from people's garages. So not too long before the church halls, when I started, there had been garages. In fact, some teachers were still teaching out of their garages. There certainly were not studios. And when my teacher wanted me to start teaching, she badgered me for about 7 years. I worked out eventually because she wanted to be able to take holidays and have me fill in. So she just kept saying, you need to think about teaching. And I resisted for 7 years, actually, possibly more. No, 8 years. And even by the time I did my teacher training in 2002, there was the organisation I trained with. There was one studio in Sydney that was doing it. And I think that was it. They were my options, those two places. So that was 20 years ago. And now you'll see there's a massive proliferation of studios and teacher training courses and all sorts of things. And that's happened so quickly. Not necessarily for the better, I have to say. The reason why I didn't teach for so long was because I knew I needed to be a student for as long as I could in order to be able to teach students. Because if you don't understand what it's like to be a student, then you can't teach them, particularly for this, I think. So yeah, it's changed a lot. The focus is very much on the asana practice, and that's the posture practice, and that is only in the traditional system of teaching, that only exists to prepare the body for meditation. The reason why we need a lot of it in the West is because we sit all day and we're not working our bodies a lot, so we need to do a lot of work to open up in order to sit and meditate or lie down in relaxation at the end. But that seems to, in so many ways, to have become all it's about, and that's a shame. It is a system that's thousands of years old, and I was lucky to be taught by someone who knew that. And I had the one teacher for 20 odd years, and then I have a teacher now I've had for years, and both of them very steeped in knowledge about the tradition of practice.
I think today there's more of a trend, just particularly with Instagram, for yoga to become more of an aesthetic, where you go to this gorgeous studio, but then you're also paying $60 for one class or something like that.
Yeah, it's an experience, but not the sort of experience I was perhaps talking about at the start when I said people come for an experience. It's a scented candle experience now. In my day, we had stinky rubber mats that my teacher had imported from South Africa. They smelled like dead animals. That's what it was like in those days.
We've got a question from John and Kay, and they want to know any tips for would-be writers who lack motivation, particularly if you find yourself in a lockdown.
Yeah, so what I always say in this instance is the first thing to do is find out your tendency in the Gretchen Rubin 4 Tendencies framework. So if you go to the 4 Tendencies quiz online and find out what your tendencies are, this is to do with habit forming and habit breaking, but particularly if you're trying to form a habit of writing, because the biggest tendency is the obliger tendency, and that's the group that needs accountability partners. So a lot of people will say, why can't I motivate? I really want to write. Why aren't I motivated to do it? And it's often because you need an accountability partner. And that's just someone who's going to check in on you and say, how much have you done? And so Gretchen's work is, she's got a book called Better Than Before about habit forming and habit breaking, which I highly recommend just for general interest, but particularly if you are trying to start any creative habits. I think her work's so good because it'll stop you beating yourself up for not being able to form the habits you think you should have. And then I think for writers who are working out perhaps why where the stories are coming from, or why isn't what they're working on not doing what they want it to do. The two rules I always say are, number one, get out of your own way, and number two, get over yourself. That's it.
Great advice. What else do we have? Janine would like to know, what books do you read and what's your recent favorite?
I read a whole lot of stuff because I also read for work, because I'm published non-fiction books in my day job. So I love non-fiction as a reader, but I also love all sorts of fiction. So the book I just finished that I absolutely loved was Jackie Collins' Rockstar, because it was great entertainment. I love a bit of Jackie Collins, as the jacket I'm wearing may indicate. But I also, I was brought up to read eclectically. My parents are voracious readers. They never categorize books according to literary or commercial or anything like that. So if they like the sound of the story, they read it. So I have a whole lot of books here, and I loved Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, who's one of my favorite writers. She wrote a book called Eligible, which was a modern take on Pride and Prejudice. And I always thought, I do not want to read that. But then I thought, I really love her writing. I'll give it a go. And it's just this beautifully done piece of work. Like, from a writing point of view, it's fascinating how she's done it. And it was a completely enjoyable experience. So if the story sounds interesting, I'll read it. Or if the content sounds interesting, if it's nonfiction.
We've got another question from Karen, and she says, Sophie, I loved your book. You said you access creativity through your body. Does that connection have a therapeutic benefit, and therefore does your writing flow more easily, i.e. preventing writer's block? Do you practice yoga every day before you approach your writing?
I don't practice every day necessarily. I practice when I feel like it, but the teacher I've been studying under for the past few years is an American teacher called Shiva Ray, and she has particular ways of working that she's developed over the years that are hugely beneficial in terms of accessing creativity through the body. And I know that I wouldn't be writing if I had not been studying with her for years. And that's to do with the energy system of the body, with chakras and how they work, and it would take a while to go into that in depth, but the way she has constructed practices and how she consolidates them and puts them all together in the overarching practice of all of her work has just meant that I found at a certain point that there just weren't blockages, weren't in my mind. And also because what she teaches is unusual in terms of the traditional canon of postures that we know in the West. I think if I'd opened my mind, having opened my mind to her work, it was then easier to open my mind to other things. Having let go of any judgment around what she was doing, I could let go of judgment of what I might want to do. And I think also coming back to that idea of having courage on the mat, having courage to take creative risks as well. And it may not work. Writing fiction may not have worked. It was a risk. I was prepared to take the risk that it wouldn't work.
I think that also goes back to what you were saying about purposefully carving out time for yourself, and especially as a woman, how that is a revolutionary act. So especially for writers saying this time is mine and only mine. And especially for all the women who have joined us here tonight.
Yeah, because there are lots of demands. We're running a household. We often don't talk about, we talk about childcare and things, but actually I purposefully use the term running a household because that is a ton of work. It involves a lot of organisation, keeping a whole lot of balls in the air at once. It's a lot of short, sharp tasks, repetitive short, sharp tasks that can go on for hours. And that is actually at odds with creative practice because it's very hard to get into any kind of flow if you've got to run off and do the washing, run off and cook something, defrost, do that sort of thing. So I think it's important to bear in mind if you are trying to start that creative practice, 10 minutes is fine. You don't need to sit down for an hour. You can get a lot done in 10 minutes. If you don't question your legitimacy for being there or your right to have that time, or question the purpose of what you're doing. If you think, no, I want to do this, whether it's playing an instrument or writing a novel, whatever it is, you want to do it for that 10 minutes, just do it. Don't waste time questioning it. Just do it. 10 minutes is fine. And those 10-minute increments will add up and soon you'll have a body of work and you'll think, hey, That was good.
Yeah. Those are all the questions we've got in the chat. Kate, do you have any final words?
Well, actually, I thought I might finish with a little quote, a little passage from the book, because to me, this was such a lovely, actually, I highlighted it again in pencil, because it was such a lovely microcosm to me of what this book was trying to tell me the whole way through. And it's a sort of, I will precede it by saying it's sort of in a funny scene in which one of the characters has some quite profound physiological responses to the yoga lesson. So she
based on life, Kate.
She has to evacuate herself a little bit after the lesson. And Grace Maud thinks the whole thing is a little bit, this is all just a bit much, and Sandrine, the teacher, she says, change is always hard. When we come to the practice, we bring all the junk of our lives. Non, she says in her French accent. That is why we come a lot of the time, because we know we need to be rid of that junk. But it took years to build up, you see, and it is not quick or easy to throw it out. But we must throw it out if we want to return to ourselves, if we want to be whole. And I just had to circle that in pencil, and I went back to it again and again because I just loved it. And it felt to me not just what the promise of this book is for all the readers who have yet to read and enjoy it, but also just such a lovely thing for all of us experiencing such a lot of change and disruption to our lives at the moment. So Sophie, I wanted to say to you, thank you so much for your time this evening. It was so delightful to connect with you and to hear so much about the wonderful Thursdays at Orange Blossom House. If you haven't read it, everybody, please run out and get it. You can order through Avid Reader, who deliver around Australia. And or if you are local to another place, please do check it out from your local independent bookseller as well. Thank you.
And I'd like to say thank you to everyone watching. Thank you to Jana from Avid Reader and Kate. An absolute privilege to spend time with you because you're such an extraordinary person. Everyone should be your super fan, Kate. I certainly am. Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
Off the back of what Kate was saying as well, please support your local lockdown bookstore, especially if you're in New South Wales. They really need our help. Thank you, Sophie and Kate. I got so much out of this chat and I'm really excited to read the book myself, and I hope everyone here is as well. Thank you for joining us on Zoom tonight. And again, sorry we can't be together in person, but one day, maybe for your next book, Sophie.
Yeah, hopefully, I'd love to be there.
Fingers crossed. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.